I was born into silence, the kind that doesn't come from peace but from absence. My father left before I could walk, and my mother's tired eyes said more about life than any story ever could. Our home wasn't really a home, it was a crumbling, one-room space under a rusted roof that sang with every raindrop. There were nights I fell asleep counting drips from the ceiling like stars, pretending each one was a wish falling from heaven. But wishes don't feed you, and we were always hungry. That I remember the first time I realized we were poor. It wasn't when we skipped dinner. It wasn't when the landlord came banging on the door, threatening to toss us out. It was when I saw a kid my age throw away half a sandwich because he didn't like mustard. I stared at that sandwich like it was gold. I remember wanting to ask if I could have it, but pride is a strange thing. Even when you're starving, it holds you back. That's why mother worked herself to the bone. She cleaned other people's homes, washed their clothes, and smiled like it didn't hurt. But every night, she came home a little more bent, a little more worn. I was just 12 when she first collapsed in the kitchen. I didn't know what to do. I held her hand and begged her not to leave me. That night, we shared a piece of dry bread and water, and she smiled through the pain. She told me, the heart survives longer than the body. Keep your heart good, and life will surprise you. I carried that with me, even when everything else fell apart. When she passed, I was 15 and alone. The state didn't want me. Family didn't exist. So I did what I had to. I found scraps, odd jobs, sold what little we had. Sometimes I slept on benches. Sometimes in abandoned buildings. Hunger became a friend, one that always followed me around, but I never stole. I never begged. There was a code I lived by. If I lost that, I'd lose the last piece of my mother. Years passed like pages torn from a book I wasn't writing. Every day was survival. I didn't have dreams. Dreams were for people who had something to wake up for. I only had the next hour. The next corner to turn. The next place to rest. Until one rainy evening, when everything changed. It was cold. My jacket had holes, my shoes were soaked, and I had just enough money for a small meal, half a sandwich and a cup of coffee from a street vendor. I sat on the edge of the park, under a flickering lamp, biting slowly to make it last. Then I saw him. He looked worse than me, if that was even possible. His beard was wild, his eyes were lost in another world, and his clothes barely held together. He walked like each step hurt, like his soul had already left and his body was just following. He sat across from me, under the same lamp, but said nothing. Didn't even look at me. Just sat. Shivering. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was my mother's voice. Maybe it was the part of me that still hoped I was more than a ghost in the world. But I stood up, walked over, and handed him my food. He looked up like he hadn't seen another human in years. His hands trembled when he took the sandwich. I gave him my coffee too. He said nothing. I didn't expect him to. I just nodded and sat back down. I watched him eat like it was his first meal in weeks. And when he was done, he looked at me with eyes full of tears and said, "You've given more than food today. You've given proof that kindness still exists." I nodded again, smiled, and said nothing. That night, I went to sleep hungry. But for the first time in a long time, my heart felt full. The next morning, everything was different. I woke up to find the stranger gone. But beside me was a small paper bag. Inside it was a note: "Good men hide in plain sight. You just fed the right stranger." And under that note, was a key, not just any key. It had a tag. An address. A name. Confused, I followed it. The address led to an old but beautiful house in the quiet part of town. My instincts told me to run, that it was a mistake. But curiosity pulled harder. I knocked. An older woman opened the door. She looked at the key, then at me, and gasped. "You're the one my brother told me about." I had no idea what was happening. She pulled me inside and gave me something I hadn't felt in years: a warm towel, a real bed, a plate full of food. I wanted to cry but held it in. Over the next few days, I learned the truth: the man I fed was not just a homeless stranger. He was a billionaire's brother, estranged from the world by his own choice. He'd been testing humanity, wandering as a beggar to see if kindness still lived. Most people ignored him. Some mocked him. One tried to rob him, but I gave him my only meal. That one act changed everything. That he left me his house, a trust fund, and a letter explaining it all. I have wealth, but you have soul. I trust you'll do something good with both. And I did. Years later, I opened a shelter in my mother's name. I made sure no one had to choose between pride and a meal. I told my story not to boast, but to remind the world that one act of kindness, just one, can change a life. That I was poor until I gave my last meal to a stranger, and in return, I was given everything. That at first, I didn't know how to handle the wealth. The trust fund was real, more real than anything I'd ever held. My name was now attached to bank accounts that had more money in them than I could ever count. But wealth isn't freedom if you've never known choice. For days, I still walked to the corner coffee shop and sat under the flickering lamp where I gave away my last meal. I needed to feel grounded, like I hadn't drifted too far from who I was. That I kept thinking of my mother. How she would have smiled, not because I had money now, but because I finally had a chance to do something meaningful. Her voice echoed in every thought I had. Keep your heart good, she had said. And life will surprise you. The house the stranger left me was old, but beautiful in a quiet, soulful way. Wooden floors that creaked when you walked, walls filled with vintage books, windows that knew how to let the morning light in just right. There was even a fireplace, though it hadn't been lit in years. The old woman who greeted me, her name was Evelyn, became like family. She was the stranger's sister. She told me he was once a genius, a pioneer in tech. But he'd seen too much greed, lost too much soul in the process, and walked away from it all. He wanted to see if people could still be kind when no one was watching. That he never told her what he was doing. But before he died, he sent her a letter: one will give freely without knowing they're being tested. Find him. Help him. He will carry what I could not. I didn't feel ready for any of this. But sometimes life hands you a torch, even when your hands are still shaking. And you either drop it, or you carry the flame. That I chose to carry it. It began slowly. I started volunteering at soup kitchens under a fake name. I sat beside the ones no one talked to. I listened. Not just to their words, but to their silence. I understood that silence better than most. Then, I bought an abandoned lot in the city. People thought I was crazy. It was broken, forgotten, full of shattered glass and rusted dreams. But I saw something else. I saw possibility. That I hired local workers, people who'd been turned away too many times. I paid them well, treated them with respect. And together, brick by brick, we built something real. The first shelter opened 6 months later. I named it, the Lantern House, after the flickering street lamp under which I gave away my last meal. It was more than a roof. It was warmth, food, dignity. It was a place where people were seen. Where every story mattered. On opening day, I stood in front of a small crowd. My hands trembled, but my voice didn't. I told them everything. My life. My mother. The stranger. The sandwich. The miracle. Some cried. Others stood still like their hearts had been cracked open, but one boy, maybe 17, walked up after everyone had left. He looked like I once did, tired eyes, hungry, angry at the world but still clinging to hope. He asked me, "Did you ever feel like giving up?" I smiled gently. Every single day. But I didn't. And neither will you. He didn't say a word. Just hugged me and cried. That hug reminded me why I was still breathing. Months passed. Then years. The Lantern House grew. 1 turned into 3. Then 5. Then a foundation. I hired counselors, medical staff, job trainers. I didn't want to just feed people. I wanted to help them rise, but no matter how big things got, I never forgot that night. That cold, wet night when I gave everything I had. The moment when I expected nothing, and was given more than I could ever imagine that I kept the note. The key. The cup the coffee came in. They sit in a glass frame in my office now, beside a photo of my mother. People often ask why I never changed my name, never showed up on television or made speeches about generosity. That I tell them the truth, the most powerful acts are the quiet ones, not everything needs applause. One snowy morning, I walked out of the lantern house and found a note taped to the gate. You gave me soup when no one would look at me. I now work at a tech company, and I just hired someone else who was once like me. Thank you. You started something. That note meant more than any check. More than any donation, because kindness isn't a performance, it's a seed you plant it once. And it keeps growing in places you'll never see. That I started writing letters to my future self. Not because I feared forgetting, but because I wanted to remember what it felt like to have nothing. Those letters kept me humble. Focused. Human. One of them simply read, if you ever forget who you are, go to the park bench under the flickering lamp. I did, often. That I sat there, anonymously, with a sandwich and coffee. Sometimes no one came. But sometimes, someone sat beside me, and when they did, I gave them the meal. And I watched the light return to tired eyes. Years passed. My hair grayed. My knees ached. But my heart still beat with the fire of that night. Eventually, I bought a small cabin by the lake, not to escape, but to reflect. Evelyn passed, but not before she told me her brother's final wish. He wanted to prove one man could still change the world, even if no one ever knew his name. I buried her beside him, beneath a tree that blossoms every spring. I visit often. That I tell them stories of the people we helped. Of the ones who made it out. Of the ones we lost. Of the ones who still come back to say thank you. That I sit, and I whisper, he was right. Kindness still lives. The Lantern House Foundation now spans 10 cities. That I'm not rich anymore, not by billionaire standards. But I'm rich in something deeper. I sleep without regret. That I've built a legacy with my hands, my pain, and one act of selfless love, all because, one night, I gave my last meal to a stranger, and in doing so, I fed the soul of the world. That I had always imagined that success would feel louder, that it would come with bright lights, interviews, or maybe even a book deal. But the truth is, when your mission is built on something silent, success feels like a whisper. A warm cup of soup in a trembling hand. A clean bed after months on concrete. A second chance offered without judgment. One day, during winter, a girl no older than 8 walked into the shelter alone. Her shoes were mismatched, and she wore a thin hoodie that had lost its shape years ago. The wind outside howled like it was angry at her for surviving. I knelt beside her and asked where her parents were. She looked at me and said in a voice that didn't match her age, they got tired. It broke something inside me. But I didn't let it show. I took her in, gave her food, warmth, and a room of her own with drawings on the wall and a stuffed bear someone once donated. For the first few nights, she didn't speak. She just watched. As if she were waiting for the kindness to disappear, but slowly, she opened up. Her name was Lily. She loved to draw stars. Said she liked imagining they were souls of people who were too kind to stay on earth. She said her mom was one of them. That I found her a counselor. Enrolled her in a local school. Got her a bed, a desk, a backpack. And one night, as I was locking up, I found a drawing tucked into my coat pocket. It was of me. Standing under a streetlight, giving someone a sandwich. Above the picture, she had written, "You're a star that didn't leave." I cried that night harder than I had in years. Not out of sadness, but because I realized something I had never said out loud. I had become the man I wished I'd met when I was homeless. More people came. Some left with jobs and stories of redemption. Some returned just to volunteer, saying, "This place saved my life, and now I want to help save someone else." It became a chain, one act of kindness breeding another. Like echoes that never stopped bouncing off the walls, but not all stories were happy. Some people I couldn't save. Like Samuel, a man in his 50s who used to be a jazz musician. He would play air piano in the shelter, his fingers dancing through melodies no one else could hear. He had lost his wife in a fire. After that, he lost everything else that he smiled every day, but it wasn't real. It was a smile that begged you not to ask questions. One night, he didn't return to the shelter. We found him 3 blocks away, on a bench, cold and still, with a note in his pocket that read, "Thank you for giving me back music, even for a while." We held a small ceremony for him. Buried him with a piano key around his neck. I spoke at his service, telling those in attendance, even if a candle burns out early, the light it gave still matters. Stories like his reminded me that I couldn't save everyone, but I could keep trying. Some nights, I still walked the streets alone. Not to remember pain, but to listen for it. You learn to hear the different kinds of silence, the kind that means loneliness, the kind that means hunger, the kind that means someone is on the edge. When I heard it, I didn't talk, I just sat beside them, and most of the time, that was enough. There was a boy named Kareem who once tried to rob me in the alley behind Lantern House. He had a knife, but his hands were shaking more than mine. I looked him in the eyes and said, "Are you hungry?" He didn't answer. I pulled out a sandwich and coffee from my coat. His eyes darted, confused. "You trying to trick me?" he asked. "No," I said softly. "I'm trying to feed you." He took it. Ate it like it was his first meal in days. He dropped the knife after 2 bites. Sat down. And cried. He later told me he hadn't cried in 10 years. I gave him a job the next week cleaning the shelter. 2 years later, he was managing one of the new branches in another city. He always told people, "A sandwich and a stranger saved my life." One evening, the city mayor invited me to a fundraiser. I almost didn't go. It didn't feel like my world. But I did. And I spoke, not about numbers or finances, but about Lily, Samuel, and Kareem. I told them how one sandwich changed everything. I didn't ask for money. I asked them to believe. Donations flooded in. That year, we opened shelters in 3 more cities. Each one was designed the same way, humble, warm, human. They were not just shelters, they were memory palaces, built on the backs of moments that I started a program called The Second Step. It wasn't just about survival, it was about growth. We offered job training, counseling, financial literacy, and creative workshops. I even brought in musicians and artists who had once stayed with us. They returned not as guests, but as mentors. One man, Jorge, who used to sleep under a bridge, now taught painting classes. He once said during a session, "The world threw me away. This place gave me a canvas instead." I never married. Maybe I was too afraid. Maybe my heart had already been poured into something bigger. But I was never alone. Every person who walked through those doors was family. Each one carried a piece of my story with them. I grew older. Slower. My hands that once dug foundations now trembled when I wrote letters. But I never stopped visiting the original park bench. The one under the flickering lamp. Sometimes it still flickered. City never fixed it. I liked it that way. One night, near Christmas, I sat with a scarf around my neck, holding a warm cup of tea. A young man sat beside me. Thin. Pale. Lost. I recognized the look. I handed him my cup and half of my sandwich. He looked at me like I was crazy. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. I smiled and said, "Because once, someone did it for me." He took the cup. Drank. Sat silently beside me. And whispered, "Thank you." Then he said, "Someday, I'll do the same." I looked up at the sky. Stars flickered like distant hearts. I could almost hear my mother's voice in the wind. And I whispered back, "That's all I ever hoped for."